They expected just another late-night interview, chatter about polls, policies, and press briefings. But the moment Karoline Leavitt stepped under the studio lights, wearing her signature cross and a quiet fire in her eyes, something shifted. She wasn't there to spin headlines. She was there to speak from the soul. And when the host brought up Pope Robert Prevost, the newly elected American Pope shaking the world with his quiet courage, Karoline didn't blink. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a letter, not from a politician, not from a strategist, but from a second-grade teacher in Ohio who said one homily from Pope Prevost changed how she greeted her class the next morning. What happened next? It silenced the studio, moved the host to tears, and sparked a national conversation about faith, unity, and the power of listening. If you believe America still has a heart worth healing, hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and share where you're watching from, because this story might just be the spark we've all been waiting for. They thought it would be routine, just another polite late-night appearance on cable news, a few safe policy questions, some praise for the president, a couple of chuckles at a well-timed joke. But what unfolded inside that Fox News studio was something else entirely. The second Karoline Leavitt stepped into the lights, something shifted in the air. Not because she was the youngest press secretary in U.S. history, not even because of the wave of media fire she'd stood through like a lighthouse in a storm, but because of one small thing, barely visible to the casual eye, a delicate gold cross resting against her collarbone. That cross would become the thread that unraveled a story bigger than anyone in the studio expected. The host, a seasoned DC insider with a reputation for mixing charm with razor-edged commentary, rose from his seat as she approached. "Karoline," he grinned, arms wide for a brief friendly hug. "You run the White House press room, raise a toddler, and still walk in here like you've just finished a campaign rally. What's your secret?" The crowd, mostly staff and a few invited guests, laughed. Karoline smiled, adjusting the sleeve of her sharp blazer. "Faith, family, and a strong cup of black coffee," she replied, her voice bright but grounded, her accent pure New England. The crowd applauded again, but it was a softer kind of applause, the kind that said, "This young woman isn't just polished, she's real." As they both sat, the camera zoomed in, catching that moment just as Karoline's hand lightly touched her necklace. She didn't mean to. It was instinct, like prayer. The host noticed, but said nothing. They began, as always, with headlines, questions on inflation, on border tensions, the president's recent executive orders. Karoline was poised, quick, persuasive. She quoted figures, explained policies in plain terms, wove in stories from the road, meeting small business owners in Des Moines, veterans in Phoenix, single moms in Detroit. But then, it happened. The host leaned forward, his voice lowering slightly. "You're a devout Catholic, Karoline. Always have been, right?" She nodded. "Since before I could walk." "Well, I have to ask, what's your take on Pope Robert Prevost, first American Pope, making global waves? And some folks say he's the most quietly revolutionary figure the church has seen in decades." The entire room shifted, a murmur of stillness, if such a thing exists. Even the floor director froze mid-step. Karoline blinked, slowly. Her lips parted, but no words came, not yet. Instead, her hand went once more to her necklace, this time deliberately. She touched the cross like it held a story. "I wasn't expecting to talk about him tonight," she said finally. Her voice didn't tremble, but it changed. It got quieter, thicker, like someone standing at the edge of a memory. "But maybe it's time I do." The host leaned back, sensing something was coming, a moment that would linger long after the commercial break. Karoline reached into her blazer, not for talking points, not for a White House memo, but for something else, a letter, folded cleanly, as if it had been opened and read many times. She unfolded it slowly, like a priest handling scripture. "This," she said, holding the paper with both hands, "is a letter from a second-grade teacher in Columbus, Ohio." She glanced up. She's a public school teacher, been teaching for 27 years, hasn't set foot in a church in almost 10. She said she wrote me after hearing Pope Prevost's first homily. A hush fell over the studio. She said, Karoline's voice caught for just a second, just long enough to make everyone lean forward. She said, I'm not even sure I believe in God anymore, but when I heard him speak, I believed in people again. A murmur swept through the small audience. One of the producers placed a hand over his heart. The cameraman zoomed in without being told. Karoline set the letter gently on the table between her and the host. She ended with this, she continued. The next morning, I walked into my classroom and greeted my students differently, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. He reminded me why I started teaching in the first place. The host didn't speak, not yet. He didn't have to. Karoline looked out, not just at the studio, but beyond, through the camera, to the nation. To me, she said, that's what leadership is. Not fear, not control, but something that makes people remember who they were before they got tired, before they gave up. The host cleared his throat, visibly moved. You're saying the Pope is inspiring more than just Catholics? Karoline nodded. Yes, he's inspiring Americans. The host reached for his coffee, stalling for composure. But Karoline wasn't done. She opened her palm and revealed a small note, one scrawled in a child's handwriting. Left for me in the White House press room last week, she said, by the daughter of a janitor. She handed it to a Secret Service agent and asked if he could please give this to the lady who talks on TV. The crowd chuckled softly, but then Karoline read the card aloud. Pope Prevost says we should be kind. Are you kind? She folded the note with reverence. I don't know about you, she whispered, but that question stopped me in my tracks. The host was silent. So was the room. Karoline turned once more to the camera. I came here to talk about policy, but maybe policy starts here, she said, tapping her chest. In the heart, in the choice to care, to listen, to remember we belong to each other. A few audience members wiped away tears, not because of politics, but because something bigger had entered the room. Faith. Karoline smiled then. Not the practiced political smile, but something real, something raw. When Pope Robert Prevost stood on that Vatican balcony, something shifted, not just in Rome, here, in Des Moines, in Dallas, in D.C. She lifted the letter again. This teacher in Ohio? She said his words made her believe in a better classroom, and maybe that's where America starts again, in small rooms, with soft voices, and second chances. The host finally spoke. Karoline, you've turned this interview into something sacred. She nodded, her cross glinting under the lights. I didn't plan to, she said, but maybe God did. And in that moment, the news show didn't feel like television. It felt like a chapel. The camera panned slowly across the audience, eyes glistening, heads bowed. This wasn't politics. It was hope. And Karoline Leavitt, the youngest press secretary in U.S. history, had just become its quiet messenger. The studio hadn't recovered. Even after a commercial break, you could still feel it in the air. The weight of Karoline's words, the gravity of the letter she just read from a second-grade teacher in Columbus. The host, usually sharp and composed, sat a little straighter in his chair now, like something had shifted in him too. He looked at Karoline, not as a political guest, but as someone who'd just reminded America why it tuned in. And Karoline. She wasn't done. She reached into the stack of notes on her lap and pulled out a yellow envelope. It looked out of place in such a polished setting, with handwriting that looped and dipped like it belonged to a simpler time. This, she said, turning the envelope in her hands, arrived 3 days after I read that Ohio teacher's letter at a private luncheon for educators in Maryland. She paused. It's from another teacher, but this time from someone who almost gave up teaching altogether. The host leaned in, and the camera followed. She's in her 60s, teaches English in rural Kansas. Her letter wasn't short, but I want to share just a part of it. Yatsam. Karoline opened the envelope with a gentleness that suggested reverence, not performance. I've watched the world change around me, she read aloud. Some days, I feel like everything I was taught to believe in is slipping away. Manners, truth, even God. I almost retired last year. I packed up my classroom and left it clean. But then I heard Pope Prevost speak, and something stopped me. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. He didn't speak like a man trying to command a room. He spoke like a man trying to comfort it. The studio stilled again. She wrote, "That night, I went back to my classroom. I put the chairs back. I unpacked the books. I reopened my heart. Not because I thought I could change the world, but because I believed the world could still be changed." Karoline folded the letter with trembling hands. "She's still teaching today," she whispered, because one man's words gave her the strength to believe again. The host blinked, his jaw tightening to keep emotion at bay. "That's the second teacher you've read from," he said softly. "Why do you think Pope Prevost is striking such a chord with educators?" Karoline took a breath. "Because he listens," she answered. "And every good teacher knows. Before you teach, you listen. Before you lead, you understand." She paused, looking directly at the host, and by extension, the country watching. "That's something we've forgotten in Washington, and maybe in this whole world of shouting." She glanced at the camera. "Maybe it's time we stop broadcasting and start listening." The host nodded slowly. There was something in Karoline's tone, something that carried more than political messaging. It was a kind of quiet authority, the kind that came not from power, but from purpose. "And these letters," he asked, "they're coming often?" Karoline's lips curved gently. "After I spoke about Pope Prevost for the first time, my staff started sorting mail differently," she explained. "We used to file them under faith-based correspondence. But the volume got so high, we had to start a new folder, Hope Letters." The crowd chuckled lightly at the name, but it wasn't a joke. Karoline nodded. "Every week we get more, from janitors, from nurses, from Vietnam veterans, from teenagers with anxiety, from widows who haven't stepped inside a church in 20 years. She held up another envelope. This one was smaller, postmarked from Birmingham, Alabama. "This one," she said, "was just 2 lines long." She unfolded the card and read, "He reminded me how to pray again. That's all. Just thank you." Karoline held the card delicately, like it might crumble if she squeezed it too hard. The host exhaled. "You said earlier, this isn't just about faith," he said. "That it's about something else. What did you mean?" Karoline turned to him, and for a moment her face looked different, softer, more maternal, more reflective. "It's about belonging," she said simply. "It's about a country full of people who feel like they've been forgotten, who scroll through headlines and wonder, where is my place in all this?" She placed the card from Alabama on the desk beside the others. "And when someone like Pope Robert Prevost speaks, not to the powerful, not to the elite, but to the broken-hearted, that's when people remember. They still matter." The host didn't speak. He didn't have to. The camera stayed on Karoline. She reached into her bag again. "Would you mind if I read one more?" The host gestured for her to continue, visibly moved. "This one's from a dad, a truck driver from Nebraska. He said he hadn't been to Mass since his father's funeral 25 years ago." She unfolded the letter. "I'm not a letter writer," she began, her voice growing stronger. "But when I saw the Pope say, 'We are not called to dominate, we are called to lift,' I had to pull my rig over and cry on the side of the road. I called my daughter when I got home. I told her I loved her, that I was proud of her, that I was sorry for the years I didn't know how to be kind." Karoline paused. He ended the letter with this. It wasn't a sermon, it was a whisper, but it changed me. The studio was completely still, the kind of stillness that feels sacred. Karoline laid the letter down. "People aren't writing because they're told to," she said. "They're writing because something inside them woke up." The host nodded slowly. "And they're writing to you," he added. "Why do you think that is?" Karoline hesitated. Then she smiled, gently. "Because I'm not just reading press briefings," she said. "I'm listening, and I think maybe they just needed someone to listen back." A long silence followed. Then the host cleared his throat. "Well, Karoline, I think I speak for a lot of Americans when I say thank you for reading these, for bringing them here, for making this studio feel more like home tonight." Karoline reached for one last letter, but paused. "I'll read this one next time," she said, slipping it back into her bag. "It's from a hospice nurse in Montana, and her story deserves its own moment." The host smiled. "Then we'll hold that moment for next time." The camera slowly zoomed out, the warm studio lights glowing a little brighter, and as the segment faded to black, the screen displayed a single sentence. "If you've ever felt forgotten, know that someone still sees you, and hope is still alive." The camera hadn't blinked in nearly 10 seconds. It just lingered there, on Karoline's hands, folded gently on the letters in front of her, as if even the lens needed a moment to absorb what had just been shared. Then the host leaned in again, his voice lower, not out of secrecy, but reverence. "You said earlier there were letters from veterans too?" Karoline nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "and one in particular. I've never forgotten." She picked up a letter bound with a rubber band, its edges worn like it had been carried in someone's coat pocket for years. It was slightly crumpled at the corners, the ink faded, not out of age, but out of time. "This came from a man named Walter," she said, "an Australia veteran living in Dallas. He didn't write it to me. He wrote it for himself, but someone found it, and it found its way to my office." The host sat quietly, sensing the weight of what was about to unfold. Karoline unfolded the letter, smoothing it gently against the desk. "Dear, whoever reads this, I'm not a religious man, not anymore. That left me somewhere outside Sydney in '68. But last Sunday, I saw Pope Prevost on TV. He wasn't preaching, he was listening to a boy who lost his dad in a fire. The Pope didn't say much, but when he touched that boy's shoulder, it was like the whole world went quiet. And for a second, I felt something I hadn't felt in 50 years. I'm writing this because I think I still believe in good people, not saints, just decent ones. That boy, he reminded me of the sons I never got to raise, and the silence I've lived in since." Karoline paused, folding the paper halfway and resting her hand on it. "You could tell he didn't mean to send it. You could tell it wasn't meant for public eyes," she said softly. "But maybe that's what made it sacred." The studio didn't move, not a single cough, not a whisper. Karoline looked into the camera. "You know, we always say, 'Thank you for your service,' but we rarely ask, 'How's your soul doing?'" She glanced at the host. And that's what Pope Prevost did. Not with a sermon, not with ceremony, but with presence. She set Walter's letter beside the others, her fingertips lingering a moment longer. The host's voice cracked a little. "Karoline, may I ask why you chose to read that one tonight?" She turned toward him, not blinking. "Because yesterday was Veterans Day, and because someone in our audience tonight," she turned to face the crowd behind the cameras, "might need to hear that it's not too late to feel again." A slow nod spread across the small live audience. In the second row, an older man in a Korean war cap reached up and wiped the corner of his eye. But Karoline wasn't finished. She opened a small envelope with a childlike scrawl across the front. "For the lady who loves God." The audience chuckled tenderly. Even the host smiled. "This," Karoline said, "came from a girl in Tampa named Lily. She's 7. Her dad's in the Coast Guard. Her mom bakes cupcakes for the local VA hospital every weekend." Karoline unfolded the letter and held it up. It was drawn in crayon, a heart, a dove, a stick figure pope holding hands with 3 little kids. Underneath, Lily had written, "Pope Prevost says we can be friends. I think he means it." Karoline blinked back tears. "I think he does too, Lily." She turned the card around for the cameras to capture it. "That's the thing about children," she said. "They don't overcomplicate love. They don't ask for political proof. They just believe, until we teach them not to." The host leaned forward, visibly moved. "And in a world where we talk about division all the time, this message feels like oxygen." Karoline nodded. "We don't need a million new policies to fix America," she said. "We need reminders like this." Veu, she set the card beside the veteran's letter. 2 pieces of paper, 2 stories, a war-hardened soldier, a bright-eyed little girl. 2 different worlds, she whispered, but both searching for the same thing. The host turned slightly in his chair. Karoline, can I ask you something? Off script? She nodded. He hesitated, then asked, do you ever feel burdened carrying all these stories? Karoline exhaled. Yes, she said, but it's the holiest burden I've ever known. She paused. When I walk into that press room, I don't just see cameras. I see Walter. I see Lily. I see every person who sent me a folded letter in trembling handwriting, hoping someone would care. A beat passed. Some of them write because it's the only prayer they know how to say anymore. The studio fell into a sacred silence again, and then, from the audience, a hand went up. The crew hesitated. Live studio questions weren't protocol, but the host gestured to allow it. A man stood slowly. Late 60s, wearing a jacket with a faded American flag patch on one shoulder. His voice was hoarse but sure. I was in Afghanistan, he said, and I've buried more friends than I care to count. He held up a small slip of paper. My granddaughter asked me to give you this. Karoline stepped down from the chair without hesitation, walking toward the edge of the studio floor. The man handed her the paper with shaking fingers. She read it silently, then out loud. Dear Miss Karoline, my papa says sometimes people forget soldiers after the war, but I told him maybe Pope Prevost didn't. I hope you don't either. Love, Amelia, age 8. Karoline looked up. I won't, Amelia, she said. I promise. The crowd stood, not with cheers, not with thunder, but with reverence. The kind of standing ovation that doesn't celebrate, it honors. Karoline returned to her seat, the slip of paper held tightly in her hand. The host had no script left. No prepped questions, only awe. What do we do with this? He asked, gesturing to the table stacked with truth. Karoline looked at the camera. We remember it, she said. We share it, and we let it change us. She placed Amelia's note gently on top of the letters. These people aren't writing to change policy, she said. They're writing because they still believe something beautiful can rise from this country's weary bones. The audience remained standing, silent, and then Karoline leaned forward one last time. We talk a lot about protecting the Constitution, she said, but sometimes we forget that protecting the soul of a nation starts with listening to its wounded. She folded her hands over the letters. Tonight, we listened. And with that, the lights dimmed. The credits rolled, but in homes across the country, hearts beat slower, and for many, it was the first time in a long while they felt like they'd been heard. The applause from the audience had barely faded when the host looked at Karoline with a quiet curiosity. You mentioned before, he said, there's something else, something you weren't sure you'd share. Karoline paused. She glanced down at the small black flash drive in her hand. So small it seemed almost invisible beneath the stack of heartfelt letters. But in truth, it held a moment that might reshape everything. I wasn't, she said softly, but I think now is the right time. The host didn't interrupt. He knew better than to rush this. Karoline looked straight into the camera, her gaze calm, steady, inviting the viewer at home to lean in just a little closer. This is something I've watched more times than I can count, she began. It's not a press release, not an official Vatican broadcast. It's a moment that was never supposed to be seen. She held up the flash drive. It was shared with me by someone inside the Boston Archdiocese, a quiet friend, someone who said, you'll know what to do with it. The host tilted his head. What's on it? Karoline smiled, but there was something wistful in her expression. The Pope, in a room, no audience, no robes, just himself. The production team queued it up. The studio lights dimmed. The screens flickered to life. The clip began. The camera was handheld. The image a little shaky. But what it captured was unmistakable. Pope Robert Prevost, seated in a small, plain room. No throne, no choir, no Vatican marble, just a wooden chair, a window behind him, and a white shirt rolled at the sleeves. He looked into the camera, not like a speaker preparing a message, but like someone already in the middle of a sacred conversation. His voice, quiet and unpolished, drifted through the speakers. We do not build trust by shouting louder. We build it when our silence listens more than our speeches do. If you wish to lead people, first hold their pain. And if your robes are heavy with titles but light on compassion, you wear white, but you do not carry light. The video faded to black. Silence. Not just in the studio, but in the air itself. Even the host sat frozen, lips parted slightly, as if caught in the middle of a prayer he didn't realize he'd started. Karoline looked out across the space. When I first watched that, she said, I felt like I'd stumbled into something sacred, like I had trespassed on holy ground. The host swallowed. I've never heard a pope speak like that. Karoline nodded. He wasn't preaching. He wasn't even recording a message. That clip, it wasn't intended for public release. Someone recorded it during a closed-door retreat. The Pope didn't even know the camera was rolling. She turned to the audience, her voice gentle. He was just speaking to the room, to a group of seminary students, and somehow every word felt like it was written for the world. The host leaned forward. And that line, he whispered, you wear white, but you do not carry light. Karoline nodded again. It stayed with me, because it wasn't judgment, it was a challenge. She folded her hands. There are people in this world, dressed in the garments of leadership, of faith, of trust, but they've forgotten how to serve. She turned again to the camera, her gaze steady, unflinching. But then, there are a few, very few, who wear white and carry light. The audience didn't clap. They just listened. Karoline reached back into her bag, pulling out a printed transcript of that recording. This is the only copy I've allowed outside my office, she said. I keep it because it reminds me how easy it is to forget who we're supposed to be. The host reached over, gently taking the transcript and looking it over like it was a relic. You said you've watched it over and over, Karoline nodded, especially on the hard days. When the headlines are cruel, when the noise in Washington is deafening. I play that video, and I remember why I'm doing this. The host looked at her, truly seeing her now, not just as a public figure, but as a woman carrying something weightier than any press release could contain. Karoline spoke again, her voice lower, more personal. There's a quote in the transcript, she said, one that I haven't shared yet, but I think tonight's the night. She unfolded a final sheet, reading slowly. The weight of true leadership is not power. It is compassion wrapped in silence. The world is not asking for kings. It is crying for shepherds. She closed the paper. And when I read that, I saw a mirror held up to every leader in this country. The host sat still. Karoline looked directly into the camera again. And I ask you at home, do you feel led or do you feel ruled? A beat passed, then another, because there's a difference. She held up the transcript. This Pope didn't come to change doctrine. He came to change hearts, and hearts once changed can't unhear what love sounds like. The host placed his hand over his heart. You've just reminded us what leadership can look like. Karoline smiled quietly. Leadership doesn't need to roar. It needs to respond. The studio remained hushed. Karoline placed the transcript on the desk, her hand resting gently atop it. Then she added, I've received a dozen letters from people who watched that hidden clip. Some said they cried. Others said they prayed for the first time in years. One man said he forgave his brother after 30 years of silence. The host raised his eyebrows. Karoline continued, I think the most beautiful message I got was from a woman in South Carolina who simply wrote, he wore white, but I finally saw light again. A hush fell again, and no one dared to break it. Then Karoline said, I believe Pope Prevost is not here to be admired. He's here to ignite something. The host whispered, and what do you think that something is? Karoline paused. Then she answered with certainty, courage. The air in the studio was still warm from the last segment. The clip of Pope Prevost, raw, unscripted, sacred, had left the audience in a kind of stunned peace. Not silence, not awkwardness, but something almost holy. Even the host took a moment to find his breath again before he turned back to Karoline. I think you've given us more than just a political interview tonight, he said quietly. This feels like something people will be thinking about long after the cameras turn off. Karoline smiled, not wide, not flashy, just a soft curl of gratitude. There's one more thing, she said, and I think it might be the most important. She reached into the bottom of her leather bag, an older bag, fraying slightly at the seams. From it, she pulled a photograph. It was small, a little worn. The edges were curled, and the image had the slightly faded tone of age. This was taken 10 years ago, she said, turning the photo toward the host. At a prayer event in New Hampshire. I was in college, just a kid. The image zoomed in on the screen. A circle of young people holding hands in a sunlit park. In the center, Karoline. Her eyes closed, a cross necklace glinting at her neck. I kept this photo because that day, I felt something I didn't have words for back then. She looked at it again. We were praying for peace, not for policies, not for votes, just peace. She set the photo gently on the table, next to the letters and the crayon drawings. And when I heard Pope Prevost speak, I remembered that feeling. The host was silent. I realized something, she continued. That faith is not just what you carry, it's what you share. She reached again, this time for a note with rainbow-colored borders. Child's handwriting danced across the front. If you share hope, it will spread. This was left in my briefing room 2 days ago, she said. No envelope, just this. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the inside. It doesn't say much, just 4 words, keep shining the light. She held the card up for the audience. I don't know who wrote it, she whispered, but I know who it was for. The host looked at her, his expression filled with something beyond words. Karoline turned again to the camera. To everyone watching tonight, if you've ever felt like the world has grown too dark, too divided, too far gone, I want to tell you something. It hasn't. She paused. There is still light. I've seen it. In these letters, in these children, in our veterans, in a pope who doesn't shout, but listens. She took a deep breath. And if you've ever doubted whether you matter anymore, whether your faith, your voice, your kindness still count, they do. A long pause filled the room like breath held in unity. Then Karoline leaned forward, her voice thick with truth. We may not all wear white, but we can carry light. She reached down again and pulled one final item from her bag. It wasn't a letter, not a drawing. It was a simple candle, battery-operated, flickering softly in her palm. I brought this for a reason, she said, not as a prop, but as a reminder. She turned to the audience, because hope isn't just a word, it's a fire, and when you pass it, when you share it, it spreads. The lights dimmed slightly. The screen behind her displayed images of the letters she'd read, Walter's note from Dallas, Lily's dove, the Kansas teacher's prayer. Then Karoline looked once more into the camera, as if addressing every living room in America. You don't have to fix the world, you just have to light your corner of it. She set the candle gently on the desk, beside the cross necklace and the Pope's transcript. And if Pope Robert Prevost has reminded us of anything, she said, it's that small voices still carry big truth, and one heart, lit with compassion, can spark a nation awake. The host nodded, unable to add anything that wouldn't diminish the moment. Karoline continued, I think the greatest gift we've been given is each other. Letters written in shaky hands, kids drawing hope in crayon, soldiers reminding us what service really looks like. She paused. Let it breathe. And when we share those stories, we don't just remember who we are, we remember what we're capable of. She stood slowly, resting her hand once more on the old photo from New Hampshire. I don't know who needs to hear this tonight, she said, but you're not alone, and you still have a part to play in the story of this country. The audience stood. Some wiped tears, others bowed heads, and Karoline said gently, if you believe this message, if you believe America still has a light left to shine, share this video, share a story, share your hope. She smiled, just barely, because the candle only works if you pass it on.